Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donoghue. The new novel, Haven, is a beautiful and chilling story of adventure and survival from the New York Times bestselling author of Room, Emma Donoghue. In Haven, three men vow to leave the world behind them as they set out on a small boat for an island their leader has seen in a dream with only faith to guide them. In 7th century Ireland, a scholar and priest called Art has a dream telling him to leave the sinful world behind. Taking two monks, young Trian and old Cormac, he rows down the river Shannon in search of an isolated spot on which to found a monastery. Drifting out into the Atlantic, the three men find an impossibly steep, bare island inhabited by tens of thousands of birds and claim it for God. But in such a place, what will survival mean? Emma Donoghue writes fiction, novels, and short stories, contemporary and historical, most recently The Pull of the Stars, as well as drama for screen and stage. She has even been nominated for an Academy Award. Haven is the new novel, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Emma Donoghue to this week's book show. Emma Donoghue, how are you?
I'm very well. I hope nobody's thinking you have me on just as a distant relative, because I'm sure we're connected at some point.
Oh, I'm sure.
Going back to our Kerry ancestry.
I'm sure we are, because we're not talking, the island is not all that far off the coast from where you were from. Is that true?
Not a bit, not a bit. Donohues would have been living all over the mainland of Kerry and occasionally glancing out to sea a mere 8 miles or so and seeing that extraordinary pair of craggy rocks, the Skelligs, and thinking, how are those monks doing? Yes, it was a unique settlement, I would say.
Now, when I was I've made several trips to Ireland, and I wanted to go there. And yet I also was told by a lot of people that it is very over-touristed and you should be careful. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know if I want to be adding to the problem. So my understanding, too, is you've never been there.
I know I seem like a fraud, don't I?
No.
I've been there in a deep, deep sense, Joe, just not in an actual or literal sense. I did a boat trip around Skellig Michael, both Skelligs, the Great Skellig and the Little Skellig, back in 2016. And having no intention of writing about medieval monks, by the end of the boat trip, I had this entire novel, Haven, in my head. And then I thought, well, as part of my process, obviously I have to go back and land on the island. So I did book a trip for myself and the family in 2020, but COVID intervened. So we have never actually been there, but I seem to have spent most of the last few years there in my mind, living there in the year 600, which of course is different from being there right now. So maybe it's just as well I haven't been there right now, because I didn't want any tourist elements to get in the way of my imaginative embodiment of what it might have been like there, circa 600, struggling in the first landing party of monks on Skellig Michael.
When you decided after that trip that you wanted that this story came to you, were all of the elements there in the sense of looking at the nature, at looking at the remoteness, and of course looking at the religious sense of it as well?
Well, in a way, my initial focus was just on the monks. What on earth would have driven them to leave, 7th century Ireland, which was not that cushy to begin with, was not that worldly, no Netflix and chilling was involved. This was an Ireland so basic and rugged that they didn't use money yet. They didn't have villages even. They had nothing bigger than a farmstead. So the idea that these monks were driven to leave all that behind them and go somewhere even harder, I thought this was almost an absurdist kind of refugee story, in that they were trying to get a harder life. And lots of them did this. Every scrap of wilderness in Ireland seemed to have been settled by some holy man and his handful of followers. So yeah, my focus was entirely on them and their project. And religion was, of course, what it was all about.
Right.
They felt that they could live all the more purely if they suffered, and if they, stood in water up to their chin as penance, and they woke themselves up 8 times a day. But of course, as soon as I was writing Haven, I began to think a lot more about the impacts they would have had, and to see what a colonial enterprise the whole thing was, really, to claim a rock for God. It's very much like, Europeans claiming the Americas. And I think they they would have, sort of used the birds there very much in the spirit of, rounding up the natives to put them to work. So even though it was an uninhabited island, I think the whole thing has a lot of echoes of the sort of, colonial sins and crimes.
And that claiming involves the building of a church, the building of a cross, the erection of a cross on the island to stake that claim.
Yes, I found myself thinking, okay, they weren't ordinary survivalists. Their motives were really the opposite of what ours would probably be if we landed on an island. They weren't trying to make life more comfortable. So I don't think that they would have initially built their little beehive huts to shelter in. I think, yes, they would have made sure they secured some fresh water because you couldn't live many days without that. So they built a cistern to collect rainwater, as Skellig Michael has no spring or natural water source. But after that, I think very early on their priorities would have been religious. So I imagine them building a cross and then quickly starting to build a church with an altar in it. So it made for a very interesting challenge for me because obviously they were trying to survive, but also trying to, lift up their souls to the glory of God and fight off the devil through prayer. So not a regular sort of Robinson Crusoe situation.
The novel opens and they're on the mainland and we meet Art. Tell us about Art, of why he wants to stake this claim and ultimately what he is trying to flee.
I suppose he's trying to flee himself, human weakness, frailty, the body. So he imagines that if he gets far enough away from the world, for instance, he imagines if he goes to live on an island with no women on it, that lust will never be a problem for him. He imagines if he gets away from society, that just as there won't be plagues and pestilences, similarly there won't be spiritual germs, spiritual corruption. But of course he brings his baggage with him, and of course his motives are mixed too. He's a genuine religious zealot. He's not some hypocritical cult leader, but of course there are sort of built-in flaws. He loves the power of being boss over these two men. So I suppose I invented the character of Art because I was imagining that you would need a very, very driven leader to make this mad venture happen at all. I mean, it's never a sensible thing to do, to literally drift out to sea, not even knowing will you find an island before you find yourself in mid-Atlantic. So in a way, I chose my characters as if I was sort of, trying to form a dream team for a medieval monastic settlement. I needed a very, very determined, zealous leader, and I needed some other monks who had skill. So I needed an old one who has a lot of wisdom about how on earth you would scrape together a bit of soil on a very bare cliff top, basically. So I read up a lot about composting and middens and so on. I used the archaeological report of a big archaeological dig on Skellig Michael as a primary source in a way I never have before. So it was fascinating, the records of what pollen was found in each layer of the remains. And I knew that they would need somebody who was good at climbing because those cliffs are madly vertiginous. Centuries later, the monks would cut steps into them to make it easier to go up and down. But in the early days, they couldn't possibly have prioritized step cutting. So I thought I'll need a strong young one who can haul things up and down those tiny cliff paths, off which, tourists are known to fall nowadays. It's a dangerous place.
Give us an idea of this trio, because it is Art who is saying God will provide. And that's pretty much the mantra throughout for him, that no matter what comes up, no matter what questions, what concerns, what issues, it is that God will provide. So with both Cormac and Trian, it seems to me that they are looking to Art, and yet it doesn't take long before there is some skepticism. There's a point where they're saying, okay, they start to question that in this, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Especially when the conditions that they're dealing with are so harsh.
It's funny, if this was the 21st century story, I think the two monks would have rebelled on the journey, the first time that Art wouldn't allow them something. But I was really trying to capture that medieval mindset. What I find so interesting about writing historical fiction is how differently their minds worked. And medieval monks thought of themselves as voluntary slaves, absolutely bound in fealty or obedience to their abbot. It was a very feudal model. So I remember my agent saying things like, oh, but hang on, surely the monks would have said, I don't want to go to that island. And I'm saying to them, it's not about their wants and their likes. You know, they have committed to Christ, and therefore they are going to be ruled by their abbot art. It's a very completely alien mindset to us. And so in a way, the story asks the question of what would it take to make them rebel? And they're not going to do it easily, and it's all the more painful when they do have to rebel against his rule. So in a way, it becomes a sort of study of individuality and, you know, at what point would the bonds of loyalty and commitment and duty begin to fray?
I thought it was interesting, just the reaction of the monastery that they were leaving, of saying, okay, you all sure about this? You sure you want to do this? And then giving them the go-ahead.
You know, although my story might seem rather freakish, this happened all the time, really, throughout Ireland in that early medieval period. Little groups would go off and settle in the most unpromising spots they could find, the least fertile, the harshest, the most isolated. And sometimes these holy men would go and live somewhere alone, and then of course they'd be swarmed by their followers and fans, and then they'd have to go off again and find somewhere even lonelier. So this impulse to turn your back on the world, it was really strong at the time. It was a central part of Irish Christianity. And I think there was this rejection of the body in particular. You hear stories about monks, you know, whipping themselves with nettles and trying to live on as little food as possible, and just constant self-punishment. And this feeling that the body was intrinsically disgusting, really, and that, you know, women were of the body and therefore were horrible, and that what you wanted to do was sort of shed the body and get to heaven as soon as possible, which is quite a mental leap from the way most of us live now, so much more appreciative of the works of the body. But I really, as I said, I really tried to capture the sort of beauty in it as well. For instance, Trian has a kind of instinctive love of nature, very much like what we'd see in, say, Francis of Assisi in the 12th century, who saw, you know, every species as his brother and sister. So I tried to capture what a sensitive young man might feel in responding to the sheer beauty of Skellig Michael. I mean, the birds, the green, the sea in all directions. In some sense, it's a paradise, but it's also a very austere and tough place. So I really tried to make it, you know, a bit of a heaven as well as a hell.
Emma Donoghue is our guest. The new novel is Haven. It is published by Little Brown. And you bring us basically through a year, and that's really how the book is set up, of bringing us through a calendar year. Well,
I like frames and limits and rules. I've become, I suppose, quite known for enclosing my characters in limited places. I like trying to get a lot done, to change a lot in a small time period and in a limited space as well. I just love what happens when you give characters very few options. I find then it makes every interaction they have so fraught, you know? Like if, in this case, I knew what limited resources they would have been bringing on the boat. They've even, you know, left behind a good half of what they'd initially packed because it makes the boat too heavy. So I know everything they bring with them, and then I know what would start to run out. And so there's a kind of a ticking clock. And they assume that the birds will always be there for them. But of course, the end of summer, the birds leave. Even the flightless great auk swims away. So there they are in an ecosystem they don't understand. And they had assumed that the resources are limitless, but of course they aren't. So writing the story of Haven gave me a chance to kind of look at, in miniature, some of the issues that we've been talking about at the planetary scale. I mean, you know, when you're writing historical fiction, you're very influenced by what's going on now. And I remember all that talk about, you know, oh, maybe we can colonize Mars. And I thought this is just like monks thinking they could get away from the sins of the world and start afresh. You know, you're always going to bring your own bad habits with you. If you messed up one planet, I'm sure you'll mess up another. So yes, this story allowed me to look at a lot of those big issues about humans and nature, but on a very miniature scale.
To that point, about midway through the novel, you write, the dark shape of the great Skellig looms above them, blotting out half the sky. Staring up at it, Cormac asks, has either of you spotted any marks of a spring on this island? Trian doesn't answer, meaning no. Nor has Art, not yet, but he doesn't like the question's implication, the sneering hint that there may be no fresh water here. He'd like to crack their two heads together for doubting him, the haw red one and the gray wisped one. He bites his lip, tasting salt. Trust me, the island must have water since we need it to live. This place was set aside for us when the earth was made. Well, there's a lot to unpack in that, and of course, one of them is what you just discussed, which is this thought of, well, it's got to have all of these things because it was made for us, and even though it was here before, so it's going to be here again, and also how after a while, yeah, if there's three people on an island, you're gonna get on each other's nerves, aren't you?
Ultimately, I see Haven as a bit of a family story because I'm very interested in small groups of people and the different roles they play with each other based on the situation. So it's an odd family because it's three men, unrelated, and there's clearly a boss figure, a father figure, but the roles of the other two, the older one and the younger one, start to shift around him as he gets more and more unhinged. So I tried to bring out some of the sort of tenderness of family relations, you know, how they look after each other when they're sick, but also some of the sheer, you know, the power games and the unhappiness of relationships getting increasingly torturous as they run out of resources.
When you think of where you wanted to bring this story, and without giving anything away, there is, I mean, this ending is just stunning. So did you know that all along of that, or did you get there rather organically?
On that initial boat ride, I did conceive of the story, meaning that it would be about the first summer of the first landing party on Skellig Michael. And I knew what issue it was going to hinge on, the final conflict, because I wanted that to be not something external like some big, terrible, you know, storm. I wanted it to be something they brought with them, a particular you know, craving for purity on Art's part that would turn out to be hollow. But I didn't know exactly how it was going to end. And in my first version, the story ended pretty bleakly. And so actually I moved towards a slightly more compassionate and almost hopeful ending. And maybe it's because I was finishing it up during COVID and I was just not as willing to shut down on any prospect of happiness. This is a very COVID book, really. I was surrounded by people who were, you know, either feeling horribly isolated that they were cut off from social pleasures, or were developing a strange kind of relish for the quiet life at home. And so it made me think a lot about what might have driven these monks to try and get away from it all back in an era when, frankly, pandemics were routine. They were constantly being besieged by one plague after another.
The idea of a monastic life is already a solitary life, and then to bring it to this extreme, it doesn't even seem to, with the exception perhaps of Art, to fully be understood by Cormac and Trian as to just how isolated they will be.
It's true that they're isolated on Skellig Michael, though oddly enough, because they're living in this little community and they rely on each other for everything, it's also highly social between among the three of them. And, you know, each of them depends so much on whether the others have, you know, caught a fish for dinner, that kind of thing. So that's the paradox, that they needed it to be a kind of community, and yet they're sometimes tormented by each other. And one thing I was surprised by was that I ended up portraying the copying of manuscripts as a particular torture. I mean, I love books, and, you know, those early manuscripts are absolutely beautiful. But I realized once I'd researched the process of making them that this would be crippling labor. And one lovely source I had was that scribes often did little jottings in the margin or little pictures, and sometimes, you know, little rhymes suggesting how bored they were. And there was a particular type of depression that was specifically the depression of scribes. So it was funny for me that books, which have been such a joy to me, you know, they turn up in this novel as really such an endlessly backbreaking labor.
And that labor is basically to set down the rules of where they are, right? And for the future, and yes, to copy from one to another so those rules are set. The doodling in the margin comes from Trian, which obviously Art does not like.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't say the scriptures are just rules. In a way, it was the story that made sense of everything. You know, like their suffering was meaningful to them because it was a bit like the suffering of Jesus on the cross. And they deliberately stand in penance in the position, it was called cross vigil. You'd stand with your arms out like Jesus on the cross. So they were so almost in love with Jesus and passionately identifying with him, that really their whole life was lit up by this story. And, you know, Christianity is one of the religions of the book, and this was a very bookish strand of Christianity. The Irish have been credited with sort of keeping civilization alive by this endless copying and safeguarding of manuscripts. So the idea that you would, you know, go to this island where you wouldn't have any shelter or furniture or anything, and that the first thing you do would be, you know, find a flat rock and start copying out manuscripts on it. There is something heroic, if absurd, about the whole endeavor.
I so love this novel, and it's as you said, it does come off as hopeful, or at least that the characters will get what they want, perhaps. And I'm interested in your thoughts about writing about monks and writing about nuns in the novel before, of what that has been like to explore these areas, and specifically these areas of Catholicism.
Well, you know, I would have complained about nuns all the way through my youth because I was being raised by them, in that my schools were run by nuns and by Catholic teachers. But I have to say they gave me very good schooling. So I have, you know, mixed feelings. So you could say many of my novels, such as Haven and The Pull of the Stars, and also The Wonder, which I've been revisiting for the film. You could say a lot of those are kind of arguments with my Catholic past, and an attempt to kind of tease out the very good elements of that culture, and then the horrible elements, the kind of, you know, locking up and punishing of children and unmarried mothers and so on. So I suppose every writer develops, you know, complex, nuanced feelings about where they came from. And also you can comment very freely on your own culture in a way it's hard to do about other people's cultures. So I think I've been able to kind of mull over the pros and cons of Catholicism in a way you would probably find those same elements in any religion. You know, it's been suggested that every religion starts with a kind of a simple, like, oh, let's be nice to each other and don't worry about money. You know, just go barefoot through the world appreciating it. And then a few centuries later, the same religion will be full of rules and petty bureaucrats and children getting caned. You know, there's a kind of an awful fall into bureaucracy and tyranny as each religion sort of hardens. But I'm very interested in what religion still offers so many people, even though more and more readers will be coming at this novel from a completely secular point of view. But I still think they might enjoy the trip. You know, it's an extraordinary thing that a storyline like religion could make people do something as mad as going to live on an uninhabited island and seeing how little they could live on.
Let's end with this question, which I just find interesting because, as you mentioned, it could be a COVID novel, a novel that came out of COVID, certainly, and had you questioning many of the aspects of lockdown and so forth. So now that COVID has less of a grip on us, how freeing for you is that as an author?
Oh, for me, it's not that I regret any of my, say, focus on isolation and so on during COVID, but personally, I choose the world. I always choose the world. We've moved to live in Paris this year. I am going to as many concerts and plays as I can. I'm so relishing being in situations of, you know, people's breath, people's food, crammed together. I'm loving it. So, you know, I would defy art and run away from the island as soon as possible. But I'm very interested in people who aren't me. And in many of my novels, I suppose, I've explored, you know, zealous extremists who are the farthest from me that you could get. And that's one of the pleasures of writing fiction.
With that pleasure of writing fiction, then that things can be, like, the world is now open to the ideas, as I guess it always has been. But you seem freer. I mean, I would think that fact that you can go to the concerts, you can go where you want, you're in Paris, could have an effect on what you write and what you write next.
Yes, it's true. I find every place I've been to tends to have an effect. I've now been to live in France several times, actually. My French doesn't get any better, sadly, but France turns up in several of my books, and I'm going to write one set in France next. So I think travel and living in other places is hugely good for writers because it puts us in the position of being the outsider who has to puzzle out a culture and become aware of all the little cultural differences. Like I was trying to use a machine in a train station in Paris to buy a ticket. None of the machines would work for me and they were working for everyone else. And I began to feel really paranoid. Then I realized I was touching the screens too heavily. Everyone else was flicking at them lightly with their fingertips. So I literally needed to use a different kind of body language to make the screens work for me. And that kind of experience makes you feel so alive and, thrown off guard and off balance, but you feel like you're learning something every day.
Emma Donoghue's new novel is Haven. It's absolutely beautiful and just breathtaking. Emma, thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the program. I can't tell you how much I enjoy speaking to you and obviously reading your great work.
It's been a treat, Joe. Thanks so much.
Thank you. The book is published by Little Brown. Again, it's Haven by Emma Donoghue. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org, and you can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week.